Hello, I'm Paul Carroll, technical writer for Digital Photo Magazine, and welcome to this video tutorial on creating a HDR image. HDR is an abbreviation for High Dynamic Range, which has become an increasingly popular digital technique for creating very contrasty pictures, like the one we have on screen. HDR images display a large range of tones, including detail in both the darkest shadow areas as well as the brightest highlights. And typically HDR images have enhanced local details, like these patterns in the sand, creating that hyper-real aesthetic. Such effects are possible by blending at least two, but typically three shots of exactly the same scene that have been taken with different exposure settings. So for example, we'll blend one image that's been correctly exposed for the shadow areas with a second shorter exposure which brings detail through to the midtones, and with a third even shorter exposure which retains more detail in the brighter highlights of the sky. For the best HDR effect, it's recommended that we use exposures which are captured in 2-stop intervals. And as you can see from the images that we've got on screen, our exposure for the shadow areas was half a second at f22. Then 2 stops less light was recorded for the midtones, a shutter speed of 1/8 of a second at f22. And finally the exposure for the highlights was 1/30th of a second at f22. This scene therefore has a dynamic range of 5 stops and requires 3 exposures to record the scene in intervals of 2 stops. True HDR images cannot be displayed on conventional monitors. For this reason, special HDR software is required that blends together the different exposures and brings through the tones from the true HDR image into a low dynamic range image that can be viewed on conventional monitors. This process is often referred to as tone mapping, and there are many solutions available for tone mapping HDR images. And in this month's Digital Photo Magazine, we have a group test that includes some of them. And in this video tutorial, I'm going to be using one of those packages, which is called Artisan HDR version 2.7. Okay, enough talking, let's get on and see how it's done. There are 2 ways to get the exposures which are required for a HDR image. The best method is to capture enough images to record the scene's complete dynamic range with a series of exposures. For full details on how to do this, make sure you read this month's Essential Camera Skills feature in Digital Photo Magazine. If you're shooting in a RAW format, however, an alternative method is to make 3 RAW conversions, and that's what we'll be doing in this video tutorial. I'm going to be using Adobe Lightroom to convert my RAW files, but the sliders and controls are very similar to those in Adobe Camera Raw. So if you're following the technique at home, just use our start image hdrbeach.dng from off the CD and convert the RAW file in either Camera Raw or Lightroom. I've got the image loaded into Lightroom, and as you can see from the exposure I've got on screen, the start image has been accurately exposed for the midtones, but some of the shadows here in the foreground area are too dark, and the sunset in the sky is completely burnt out. So what I need to do is make 3 conversions of this file. One that we've already got for the midtones, one for the shadows, and a third for the highlights. I'm then going to export those conversions as JPEGs, and it's the JPEG files that we'll combine in Artisan. So first off, I'll export this midtone exposure. Just click on the export button. I need to specify a location, the desktop will be fine. I need to give it a name, so I'll call this one midtones, and I need to set a file settings, so I want the format JPEG with quality 100, that's obviously the best quality, and I can click export. Okay, now I want to adjust the exposure, and I can easily do that using the quick develop panel in the library module of Lightroom. Or if you're using Camera Raw, just use the exposure slider. So I'm going to reduce the exposure by 2 stops. 1, 2. And you can see that's giving me much better detail in the sky. So let's export that as our highlights image. Same location, change that to highlights, and I can leave the file settings as JPEG. Click export. Okay, now I need my third exposure, which is going to be for the shadow areas. So if I increase the exposure by 2 stops, 1, 2, that gets me back to my original mid-tone image. So then I need to increase the exposure by 2 stops again. So 1, 2, and you can see that's given us much better detail in the darker areas in the foreground. So I'll just click to export that. Call that one shadows and click export. Okay, so now I've got my 3 exposures which I need to combine together in some HDR software. So I'm going to move over to that software which is called Artisan. And you can see that I'm using the trial version. Now all of the HDR software packages that we've tested in this month's Digital Photo magazine are available as a free trial download from the manufacturer's websites. And you can find details of those websites in the magazine. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is load up our 3 JPEG images. So if we go up to the HDR menu and down to Generate HDR Image, that brings up this Merge to HDR dialog box, and it's from in here that we can browse and select our 3 JPEG images and just click Open. Now with those loaded up, we just need to check these options at the bottom. Now all 4 of these tick boxes relate to alignment. Now because we've made 3 conversions of exactly the same image, we don't need to worry about alignment or rotation. So I'm going to uncheck the automatically align source photos box. If however you're blending together 3 different files, even if they've been captured with a camera supported on a tripod, it's worth keeping the automatically align source photos box ticked, because this will correct for any tiny amount of camera movement that was caused when you press the shutter. So all I need to do now is click Apply, and Artisan will go off and blend my 3 images together and create the initial HDR image. Now this could take a few moments, so I'll join you again when it's finished. And there we are, here's our initial HDR image. And you can see that it looks pretty unimpressive, fairly flat and bland. But that's because our monitor is not capable of displaying the full bit depth of a HDR image. So what we need to do is we need to tone map the image to bring through the best luminance from the different regions to create that really hyper-real look. So I'm just going to click here on Yes, I would like to tone map my image now. And that brings up the tone mapping dialog box. And it's in here that we can control what tonal values from each exposure we want to bring through to the final image. Artisan has 3 main tone mapping operators: display, dramatic and natural. And each of these operators will blend and smooth the tones from each exposure in a different way to create a range of different finishes. Each operator has its own control sliders, and unfortunately there's not time in this video to go through them all. But when you're experimenting with HDR images, try them out and adjust the sliders to see what different effects you can come up with. In this example, I want to create that really striking hyper-real HDR image. So I'm going to use the dramatic tone mapping operator, which is the middle one from the list. And you can see just by selecting that dramatic tone mapping operator, we've really enhanced some of the contrast and the details in the foreground of the image. But the sky's still looking a little bit flat, so we're going to boost that using the sliders. Before we do though, let's just have a quick look at the preview style menu. Just click on that downward arrow there, and you can see that we've got 4 options, and these relate to how quickly the preview refreshes when we adjust the sliders. So the options that we've got are a very fast and low detail preview, a fast, a balanced and a slow and detailed. The slow and detailed option will give you a much more accurate preview. So when you apply your settings, the final image will look much more like what you saw on preview. However, tone mapping on such a large bit depth file can take a long time to apply each of your adjustments. So to start off with, I'd recommend setting very fast and low detail until you roughly get the HDR image looking like you want it, and then we can change to the slow and detailed preview before applying the settings. Okay, I'm just going to go down to the zoom options underneath the preview. I'm just going to click the fit button just so that we can see our preview a little bit larger. And then we can have a look at some of the control sliders. The sliders under the local controls menu we'll make localized adjustments to the tonal range of the HDR image. The strength slider controls the compression of the dynamic range, and by increasing the strength we get a more contrasty image. You see if I crank that all the way up to 1, there we are, we have a very contrasty image with a lot of enhanced detail in the foreground area. A strength of 1's probably a little bit too strong even for this hyper-real look that I'm after, and I'd recommend setting it somewhere between 0.5 and 0.75. So I'm going to go for the upper end, 0.75. The soften detail slider increases the micro contrast in the image. That's the contrast in the fine details, like these areas of the sand. And the fine detail slider determines how much that micro contrast is sharpened and enhanced. And you can see that if I increase the fine detail slider, these areas at the bottom of the sand here are becoming more defined. Under the balance control menu, the saturation, brightness and contrast sliders all apply global adjustments to the tones in the image. So, if for example you wanted to increase the saturation of the whole image, just pump up the saturation slider. Or to increase contrast overall, again, increase the contrast slider. That's probably taken that a little bit too far, so I'll take that back down to 0. And I can do that just simply by entering a figure in the box on the right hand side there, so I'll put that back to 0. While those adjustments are global, however, the highlights, shadows and midtone sliders will all affect the different tonal regions independently of each other. So if for example I just wanted to adjust the sky, then I could move the highlight slider to the left and that would darken the highlights in the sky. Similarly, if I wanted to lighten the shadows by moving the shadow slider to the right, I increase the shadows in the foreground. And you can see as I make adjustments to the highlights and the shadows sliders, the histogram under the levels and histogram menu is changing all the time. So keep a close eye on your histogram to make sure that the tones which are being displayed are all within the visible range. The final slider under the balance controls menu, the midtone slider. In the majority of cases, however, there will be no need to adjust the midtone slider, unless you can't get the desired results using the other sliders. And as we've already touched on, we've got a levels and histogram menu where you can set the black point for the image or the white point for the image using these eyedropper tools, or indeed use the sliders underneath the histogram to set your black point. I'm going to set mine to around 20, and white point I'm going to set that to around 235. And you can see from the histogram graph that all of the pixels within my HDR image are within the visible range. And if we take a close look at the image preview, you can see we've still got detail in the brightest highlights of the sun there, and also in the darkest shadows, which is on that island on the horizon there. However, as I want to create that really hyper-real HDR image, I'm just going to move the gamma slider, which is the slider in the center of the histogram graph, to the right, which is really going to boost up the contrast in the image. I'm going to start to lose detail, particularly in that shadow area, that darker area of the island, and you can see now that some of the tones in the image are now falling outside of my black point. However, that's creating a much more dramatic, hyper-real HDR image. Okay, that's really coming together now. Finally, we just have a little mention of the panoramic menu at the bottom. This is for stitching together panoramic images, and it's not something that I'm touching on in this video, but if you want to produce panoramic HDRs, then that's certainly possible with Artisan. These 3 copy to sample boxes on the right hand side of the screen here, they allow you to copy a sample of our preview in and compare it to another adjustment. So for example, if I copy that to sample, and that's our dramatic adjustment, and then I make an adjustment to the gamma slider, so say I reduce the gamma slider for a less contrasty finish, and then I can click copy to sample 2 and compare the 2 results. Obviously sample 1 is looking much more dramatic, so I'm just going to restore my gamma slider to where I was at, which was 1.7. And once you're happy with the overall look of the image, and remember it's a good idea to preview it with the slow and detailed preview for a more accurate preview of how your final image will look, all you need to do is click the apply button and that will generate our HDR image. Now again, this is probably going to take a few moments, so I'll join you again when it's finished. And there we are. We have tone mapped our HDR image to achieve a standard low dynamic range image that can be viewed on conventional monitors, but still displays a large range of tones with enhanced local details. The other benefit of Artisan HDR version 2.7 is that we also have some image editing controls, such as cloning, paint brushes and pencil brushes, as well as a text tool, red eye reduction, and other tools that you'll find in image editing programs like Photoshop. And these tools will allow you to make further adjustments to your HDR image before it's saved or printed. Alternatively, you can save the image from Artisan and take it over to Photoshop for further enhancement. If you are planning to do this, we advise saving the image as a TIFF file, which will retain the greatest amount of detail possible for enhancing later. To do this, just click on the drop-down menu under the Save as Type box and select TIFF from the menu. Give it a name, I've called mine Beach, and click Save. You'll be presented with this TIFF export dialog box. And at the moment, because we're using the Artisan trial version, we've only got 8 bits per channel available. But if you purchase the full product, then you can always select to save as 16 or 32 bits, and then click Apply. And that'll process our HDR image and save it as a high quality TIFF document. Okay, I hope you've really enjoyed this video tutorial. If HDR imagery appeals to you, then why not download a trial version of Artisan or the other HDR software packages we featured in this month's group test, free from the manufacturer's websites. And then you can give HDR techniques a go using our start image from off this month's free CD. Okay, cheers.